Welcome to our bonus content from our webinar, Race to the Moon. We had a great conversation ongoing when we ran out of time. Now, 4 of our 5 panelists were able to stay longer than our scheduled 1 hour to answer a few more questions. We start with a follow-on question on lunar resources. This topic was at the end of the scheduled webinar. However, others chimed in with answers once we resumed the conversation. Here's our host, David Ariosto.
Yeah. It also plays into sort of a follow-up question, and I can kick this over to you, Pete. But the follow-up question is essentially, and we can touch on any additional sort of side tangents that we have here. But this is a question from Roderick Rule. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but will the extraction of oxygen from the hydrogen, the oxygen from the regolith on the lunar surface, is that not only it's technically feasible, but does it provide the kind of oomph that you might need to kickstart commercial development in a more profound way?
Yeah, maybe I could answer that, because I think I categorically disagree that there is not near term, and there's a couple of them. I mean, the fuel is a major asset. We have, for example, Elon Musk going to Mars. I mean, that's going to take an unbelievable amount of fuel to get there, and the best source of that, the moon, and he plans that to begin later this decade. Activities in cislunar require fuel, and I think the only legitimate source of fuel is probably the moon. I might add on CLIPS. In fact, my own foundation is beginning to fund a study to put a privately funded observatories on the far side of the moon. Scientific instruments are funded around the world, are a major part of commercial development, and so I think we sort of forget about science to our peril. That increasingly we're seeing both public and private money into that, and CLIPS is, most of its payloads now are scientific, and a lot of them are beginning to be paid for privately. So I think privately there's a lot of potential for cislunar space, starting with things on the lunar surface and fuel.
And if I may just cover my tracks a little bit, let's say, I think that the divergence in our answers is at least a little bit due to my being very much focused on the Chinese side of the equation, where if I could maybe ask Yao Song for his thoughts on this, but I think in China you have much more of in terms of the lunar type missions, it's still very much a state dominated part of the space sector, let's say, and for the commercial companies there's starting to be some limited but tangible opportunities in terms of space exploration more generally. So for example, last year we saw the first RFP for a commercial cargo spacecraft for the Chinese space station. But generally speaking, this kind of lunar stuff is still a national team mission type. And so I think it's interesting to hear Pete's perspective that in the West, let's say, that there's a lot more of commercial involvement, even in these things that are quite far off. And Yao, would you say that's a fair characterization, that for commercial companies, this is still not the most near-term focus in China?
This will be the last question you have, Song. So if you could just wrap this up really quickly. I know, Pete, you have to get going.
Yeah, so I think for recent 10 years, we do not consider, commercialize the moon exploration missions. Yeah, and I think it's mostly, I think, will be funded by the government. For now, I think for the supply spaceships to the space station is inviting tenders, in China. So it's widely inviting tenders, but for moon exploration, but maybe not in our 5-year plan for now.
Yeah. Well, David, I do have a response to the cislunar thing from the Chinese perspective.
Okay.
So I think one thing that is probably good to break out here is that while we are talking about capability building, which is different from the cislunar economy, right? So while we are talking about having commercial companies build a particular competency, for example, a landing system or a lunar lander, that does not necessarily mean it's the cislunar economy. So if you look at the Chinese perspective, what they are talking about, especially from the government side, including very, very influential thinkers within China's lunar program like Wu Weiring and Bao Weiming, who designed the entire Chang'e mission, they are pointing out that resources that Pete talked about, for example, like water ice, helium-3, or platinum group metals, if successfully extracted, could result in trillions of dollars in terms of return by 2050. So there you go. There is a vision of a cislunar economy. So while the capability to get there might be state-funded, the rationale for their lunar program is not just about science and exploration, which they view as vital to build that space resource utilization capability they're talking about. And I say this because if your audience is interested, China just submitted its position paper with the legal subcommittee on the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. And in that particular position paper, the Chang'e missions have been put within the resource utilization perspective. So there is great clarity. Now, India's space program. So India has very recently announced very clear timelines for the moon. Not actually was surprising to me because in 2022, when I was there, Indian space mission did not include a lunar habitation, lunar resource utilization. After the success of the Chang'e 3, India have got confident, and now they have actually announced what is called the Space Vision 2047, which includes lunar habitation, lunar tourism, as well as lunar resource utilization, which is all geared towards telling the Indian people that space investment by India is not just about prestige, but it's about that economic return that we are talking about. So there is great clarity among nations, actually, about what the cislunar economy might be.
Yeah, you know, David, you asked about the race, and I think there's actually two races occurring. There's a capability race, and there's a commercialization race. It's not only a question of can you be there first, although as you know, several of the panelists pointed out, that's very important, but it's can you create that economy? And I think we're still having that race in low Earth orbit right now, for example. And you know, at Redwire, we were thrilled to print the first human meniscus in space. We printed cardiovascular tissue for the first time. Microgravity pharmaceuticals are going to be very important. And then on the moon, it's a question of can you repeat that? You know, are there business cases that occurs? And I think in the US, we've been tremendously successful at the public-private partnerships and generating that kind of ecosystem. I think SpaceX itself and Elon Musk has said if it wasn't for the programs like COTS, like CRS, DARPA support, SpaceX wouldn't exist today. So the public-private partnerships have driven that. And the countries that are successful in continuing and replicating that paradigm, I think are going to be the leaders of the future. India, for example, has taken great strides to try and move more towards a commercial marketplace to reduce regulations. I know the Modi government is really focused on that. So I think that's another interesting bifurcation of what this race is and what it will mean, because it's a race for economic as well as capability dominance.
In that same vein, Mike, I wonder if there are long-term unintended consequences with regard to a greater commercial pivot in the sense of personnel at places like NASA, and not just NASA, but agencies that just generally work in space. If the exciting things that are being done in space are increasingly seen as in the private sector, at SpaceX, at Blue Origin, at places like Redwire, you know, you are uniquely positioned to answer this question, I think, because you've worn both hats in a way. But, you know, I don't want to necessarily say a long-term brain drain, but it's something in that vein, right? Is there like, if people were excited about NASA because they watched the moon landing as kids, now get excited about SpaceX or because they saw Starship, or because they get excited about Intuitive Machines because they saw Odie land on the moon and near the South Pole in February. So like what are the long-term, I don't want to say consequences, but maybe unintended side effects of that pivot?
Well, I think there are unintended side effects, and I think they're tremendously positive. I think it's not a brain drain. I think it's a brain development. And when I graduated law school, which was far too long ago, my opportunities were limited to NASA or working for Boeing or Lockheed in the big primes. And look, those are wonderful entities. NASA's important, so are the big primes. The diversity of opportunity, of ideas, of companies that exist today is unparalleled. It's why I say I'm sure Apollo was extraordinarily exciting, but how many people got to participate in Apollo? How many opportunities were there for just regular people to engage? We're in an era where you can't even keep up with the different developments, ideas, private equity getting involved, venture capital. There's never been a time like this. And the unintended consequences I mentioned at the beginning of my talk is diversity. That, unfortunately, I think we still need to do a lot more at NASA to diversify the workforce. Whereas if you look at the commercial companies, they're often people who are a lot younger, a lot more diverse, a lot more international. So I think that rather than a brain drain, we've actually opened up the field to a much larger group of people who are now participating in space that weren't back in the day when space development was relatively limited. That being said, if we're going to be successful with Artemis, and particularly in the US, if we're going to be successful with national defense and commercial, we do have to keep an eye on that workforce, that we need to grow that workforce even further, which is why diversity is important, including rural communities. I just spoke at the Aerospace States Association. We need to make sure that all of America is engaged for us to be successful in space.
I want to follow up on that, but before I do, I don't want to forget, I want to get one question in that came in from Lisa Grossman at Science News. She was just asking you, Namrata, if you can clarify a little bit more in terms of the non-binding nature of the Artemis Accords and the push, I guess, from countries within the global South to maybe have a different perspective or a bit different a different sense of that in terms of potentially binding accords.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So if you look at the Artemis Accords and the Artemis program are two different things, as Mike was mentioning. And the Artemis Accords, if you look at the charter and preamble, it says very clearly that this is non-binding, which means that it is not legally enforceable. And that's why it's much more useful, because nations can then sign on to it because they don't have that binding nature, right? So in terms of the Global South's perspective, in terms of a more binding agreement, so one of the cases that I have been watching is this entire debate at the level of the United Nations in regard to UN General Assembly Resolution 7536 that talks about how do you limit weaponization of space, responsible behavior in terms of military space. And so what is interesting is that the Global South perspective, very largely, as well as a major country like India's perspective, is that while this is great in terms of normative and norms, for example, using words like responsible, irresponsible, the problem with this is that these are not legally binding. These are only guidelines. And because of that, India's position is that they abstain from this particular resolution. So the Global South makes this argument, if I may equate them. There is division within the Global South as well, but largely the argument is this, that historically there has been cases where normative positions have not secured the Global South's independence and their own ability to build themselves. So going forward, if it faces a case, it is always possible that a developed nation would, when it thinks it is opportunistic, to support a particular normative structure and then easily say that we are not bound by this when it suits their own national interests. And that's the biggest fear. And then finally, there is a lot of contention with words like sustainability, responsibility. So the argument given is that who decides who is responsible and irresponsible? Because then you're focusing on behavior and you're not really focusing on the activity. So that's a position. And all these positions, if you're interested, if your audience is interested, they're all available at the United Nations website. So they're up there.
Right.
And I would echo what Namrata said, but I do want to add just a little bit of nuance there, that the accords are a political commitment. so that when someone signs the Accords, they're politically bound to abide by it, and there would be consequences to violation, at least in terms of participating in the Artemis program. And I think the global South has been very supportive with Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, India. India was huge coming on board. And again, I just want to keep the focus on what the Accords are, which is a way to implement the Outer Space Treaty, that they're very important in taking the goals of the Outer Space Treaty and translating it to actual operations. The Outer Space Treaty says avoid harmful interference. Well, how do we do that? The Accords describe safety zones. So I think while we're absolutely correct, they are non-binding, and had we done a binding version, I think they would have been a lot less successful. We talked about the race. There's also a race to put good regulations and practices in place before we have conflict, again, preempting conflict. And that's why it was important, the non-binding nature of the Accords, so that the political commitments could be made at a pace that would keep up with technology. Because just in this call, we're talking about intuitive machines, we're talking about Chang'e 6. All of these things are happening now, which is why alacrity was of the essence.
All right, so to wrap this up, I have a bit more of a fun question that I think all of you might enjoy. Mike, you and I talked about this yesterday in the context of a question that I've heard for those who've applied for jobs at NASA is often Star Trek or Star Wars. I think it's actually instructive in some way, before we get to sort of the fun nature of this, but it's instructive in a way that everybody that I've talked to within the space industry, whether it's in the commercial sector or the public sector, kind of point to some stories that they read, whether Song, you and I talked about the three-body problem, or the nature of that Star Trek, Star Wars divide, or Space Odyssey, or even things that certainly happened in terms of the storyline of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon, the factual nature of these stories, as well as the fictional stories. And these stories tend to resonate, I think, when we're all younger, and they manifest later in terms of our direction in life. So that question of Star Wars versus Star Trek is actually kind of an interesting one, but it's not a binary choice. If you have others out there that you like to throw in there, then we can do that. But Namrata, since you're first left on my screen, I'm gonna go with you first.
Yeah, sure, David. What a great question. So growing up, I loved Star Trek. And so I remember in India watching it on a screen that would rarely come on because I lived in this remote area. It was really interesting as a kid to see a kind of future where you see everything together. And that's somehow the aspiration for all of us. But then politics and reality comes in. So the series and a movie that I think captures what's happening is Dune. I think Dune has a very interesting tale of great houses, great powers, resources, what happens when it's scarce, how people behave when it's scarce. So I think there's a lot of lessons there. So when what is fascinating to me, which we probably should also talk about, is that if you look at the narratives today, one is that it is not just limited to Earth orbits, right? We are talking about the solar system. We are talking about expanding humanity. If you look at, these are policy documents. I was looking at the US National Space Policy documents and the Chinese presentations and India's conversation. It's about the solar system. These are not just in science fiction, right? These are policy statements. So in that context, Dune is very instructive, but we also have The Expanse. So the one thing that we haven't really thought about is that we are so Earth-centric, we are so parochial in our thinking to a very large extent, that Earth is so dominant in our culture, that's where we are born. But think of a situation like The Expanse. If we expand into the solar system and we have human habitation in other regions of space, we might have completely different systems and identities, which we do not even have the imagination to think through except through science fiction. So I think we should include Expanse as well. I find the Mars and Earth and belters, a very interesting conceptualization of how identities are formed. And history tells us that when humanity immigrated, for example, when people moved to the New World, it is not necessary that they continued their allegiance with the old world. They decided to form new organizational structures. I mean, I'm in a country now that built itself in that kind of a foundation as well. So space probably, we can take lessons from our history, might have a very similar thinking as well.
All right, so that's great. So we gotta sort of cycle through the rest of these fairly quickly. So if you can kind of give your response, but just a quick reason as to why. Song, I saw you holding up a T-shirt earlier that was the Darth Vader there. So
Yeah.
I think I know where you.
Star Wars, you know. Actually, I think the first movie I ever watched in my life is the Star Wars Episode 1. Yeah, The Phantom Menace. Yeah, I think that's in my first year in my primary school or even in kindergarten. Yeah.
All right, Blaine.
I will spare you my Mel Brooks impression, but Spaceballs and the Flamethrower is the one-liner. So definitely one of my favorite movies is Spaceballs. But if picking out of the two that you mentioned, definitely
Oh,
Star
you can't
Wars.
go
And then
wrong
the
with
other,
Spaceballs. No, I can hold you to that one. That's fine if you want to do that.
it is a classic. And then just the other one that I recently saw that was interesting and thought provoking was Arrival from 2016. I've just looked up, but with Jeremy Renner and Amy Adams, I think. But interesting. Alien movie that makes you think a lot about language and the way that we communicate and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
All right, Mike.
I think just as important as any rocket, fuel, or technical component is the story or the vision that we're striving for. And you could do no better than Star Trek. Like Namrata, I grew up on a Native American reservation watching Star Trek on a black and white TV, and that is what inspired me to proceed in a career in space. It's not just about building better technology, it's about building a better future. And Star Trek inspired the Artemis Accords. The name is taken from the Kittimer Accords. Many of the values are reflected by Star Trek. And I think Star Trek and those associated, I'm thinking here Nichelle Nichols, who drove the first minority and female astronauts. The Enterprise, the space shuttle, was named after the Starship Enterprise. While I enjoy Star Wars, except for The Phantom Menace, that was almost the last Star Wars movie I saw. I was a little disappointed by the prequels. But I really enjoy Star Wars. I enjoy Dune. But Star Trek is the future we should all be striving for.
Well, there you have it. All right. Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, answering those silly questions at the end, and having actually a very substantive conversation about this sort of this next phase of exploration that we all find ourselves in. So again, we're going to be doing more of these. But for now, that's all we have. I'm David Ariosto, and thanks for joining us here on Space News.